Okay, well, let's get started then. I think we've got everything squared away. Anybody? Oh, yeah, Megan, thank you for letting everybody know. Yep, just a quick audio glitch and video glitch and recording glitch there, but I think we've got it squared away, so hopefully there's no issues with the recording. But thank you all for joining us today. Welcome back to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. This is Nick Sobral with the Science Collaborative. Today we're talking about restoration, so specifically we'll be talking a bit about what we consider successful restoration and how those metrics may differ across stakeholders. Last year, using South Slough NERR in Oregon and some other restoration projects in the region as case studies, this project team deployed a three-pronged approach to understand and improve estuarine restoration outcomes, which includes synthesis of long-term monitoring data, comparisons between manager and public perceptions, and interviews to understand efficacy of ecological metrics. So for today's webinar, we've got some members from that project team who I'll introduce shortly. You can see a few of them are on already. But before we get too far into the presentation, a bit of background for those who might be unfamiliar with the Science Collaborative and the webinar series. So for those who are new, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a national network of unique research reserves as shown on this map. Can't see the screen share, says Kat. Okay, that might be helpful. You can tell we've done this before. There you go. Now you can see the map. Before you're just missing pretty faces, but you'll see them again. So, okay. National Estuarine Research Reserve System shown on this map right here. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research, assessment, and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. And the webinar series features project teams supported by the Science Collaborative, program staff and partners, and speakers share their unique approaches to addressing current coastal and estuarine management issues. So if that sounds interesting to you, you can join us for future webinars to learn more about some of these methods to integrate technical experts and users of project outputs into the research process and how those research results and products might inform your own work. A few quick housekeeping notes. All attendees were muted upon entry. We'll be handling questions as usual via the questions feature in the GoToWebinar console. You can enter those questions at any time as they occur to you throughout the webinar. In fact, we encourage you to do that so you don't forget them. And we'll discuss as many as we can at the end of the webinar. And chat is visible to organizers only, so you can use it to alert us of any technical issues for those of you in the audience. So with that, I'll give a quick run through of the speakers today. Kat de Rivera is a professor of environmental science and management at Portland State University, and as project lead, she coordinated the transdisciplinary research of this project and engaged stakeholders to ensure useful, relevant products and outcomes. Melissa Haeffner is an assistant professor in the environmental science and management department at Portland State University and a social science lead for the project. She provided expertise for the focus groups, interview creation, and analysis. Julie Gonzalez is a PhD candidate at University of California, Davis. For this project, Julie served as the technical lead for salt marsh restoration ecology, providing knowledge of on-the-ground restoration techniques and metrics. And there are a few people who I'd like to acknowledge as well who've contributed to today's session but won't be presenting directly. Well, you may not hear or see from them directly, but Vanessa Robertson-Rojas, who provided support developing map deliverables, collecting data, and connecting with restoration practitioners in the private and public sectors, and Sabra Comet, who is the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, and she has a pre-recorded video clip, which we'll see towards the end of the presentation. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it to Kat, who should hopefully already have keyboard and mouse control, and then I'm going to get off camera.
Thanks for the introduction, Nick, and thank you all for joining us today. Our project, Restoration Success, Linking Social and Ecological Metrics, aimed to inform salt marsh restoration, specifically to identify any areas for improvement in restoration methods to support habitat function and social aspects too. Also, we aim to inform outreach about restoration so it's more effective. All right, let's see if I really have keyboard controls. I do. We therefore set out to collect social data on public perceptions about marshes, to synthesize ecological data, and then conceptually connect these social and ecological data sets and integrate them to develop recommendations. And four of us will tell you about these steps today, starting with a little background and from me, and ending with one of our South Slough NERR partners, Sabra, identifying how they are using some of the outputs from the work. Salt marshes provide many valuable benefits, yet most have been converted to other land use. And we now need habitat restoration to restore salt marshes and their function. However, the goals and outcomes of habitat restoration may look different to different user groups. This difference is important because community members are essential for habitat restoration. Before I talk about why, I want you to take a look at this picture of one of the restoration areas we studied. It provides a cool example of a sharp delineation between habitats with one side restored. And we're wondering, if you had the option of either of these habitats in your view shed, which you'd prefer. Nick is about to send a poll so we can learn the extent to which one or the other of these habitats, or both, is preferred by you all. All right, there's the poll. And I myself can't see both the poll and the slide. There's the greener area on the left and side B, and the browner area on side A. So as you fill out the poll, back to the community concerns, public perceptions of restoration success are critical because the public can influence representatives about what to support. Also, neighbors must approve NEPA or CEQA requiring projects, and getting neighbor approval is good practice regardless. These restorations ideally will be used and appreciated by the public, as we are all replenished by our time in functioning natural ecosystems and can get sustenance too. Thanks, Nick. Oh, and here we go with the outcomes. So it's thought that there's often a disconnect between scientists and other community members about what successful restoration looks like, and negative perceptions could decrease the needed support for restoration projects. From you attendees, we can see that 40% of you would prefer to see side A, the restored side of the salt marsh. About a third of you, side B, the part that was left in place for elk grazing, and another almost third like to see both. I'm glad to see none of you are neither. So thank you. Pretty even split there though. The end users we've been talking with report that some residents worry about that salt marsh restoration will ruin their views. And while maybe none of you thought that side A there would ruin your view, you can kind of understand it, that B looks pretty green and pretty. In addition, residents may worry that these projects may remove or flood what has been functional agricultural land, so this conversion back can represent a current loss to landowners. Also, habitat restoration projects can be pricey, and people might question whether this use of funds is the most beneficial to the community. Given limited funding, not that many metrics are used in monitoring. We wanted to know which standardly collected ecological metrics capture project goals, which ones align with what the public cares about, and if some measures could effectively be highlighted in communications with the public. This project developed through collaboration with our two primary end users, South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, or NERR, the Wetlands Conservancy, and also the Mid-Coast Watersheds Council, and our advisory group of end users, as well as researchers at UC Davis and Portland State University, where I work. We were also involved. We jointly created this project to help identify not only what restoration managers are doing well and not as well on the ecological side, but also how much people care about those outcomes and about factors not measured. Together, we developed and set out to answer three key questions about public perceptions of salt marsh restoration, about best metrics for measuring ecological and social outcomes of restoration, and about perceptions of education and outreach. For example, South Slough NERRS has a visitor center with long-term outreach. Another bay we studied has a university-run science center, and the third bay only has an outreach specialist dedicated to building support for restoration in that and other bays. As you just gathered, we worked in 3 places along the Oregon coast, in Yaquina Bay, in Alsea Bay, and South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve here in Coos Bay. And we did this to start to figure out what successful habitat restoration looks like to different user groups. We held focus groups in each of these bays and gathered data on 9 habitat restoration projects across them. Melissa Haeffner, our social science expert, will now talk about our engagement process and focus groups.
Thank you, Kat. So before we got started, we put together an advisory group of people who represented different institutional levels in the 3 sites that we studied. And we wanted to put together this advisory group to give us input on our research design and to look at our structure of the focus groups to make sure that the wording was culturally sensitive and represented the places that we were studying. So I can answer more questions in the Q&A version, but we built this matrix to make sure we covered all of our bases, and we used this matrix here to recruit. So once we recruited our advisory group, we also wanted to be strategic in how we engaged the group members. So we added this graphic or a similar graphic to our recruitment material and asked the potential advisory group members up front at what level they wanted to participate at. So we had this multi-layer process, and we wanted to make sure people felt comfortable in their role and that they were valuable in whichever role that they chose. We also made sure to be clear that they could choose to be to engage at one level or another throughout the project and switch around. It wasn't a static process, but a dynamic process. Some people were able to engage a lot and some only a little. So in everyday conversations, we might conflate these terms: inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower. But we wanted to be very clear about what we meant. We wanted all of our team members to be on the same page. So to try to be brief, in terms of informing, that is a one-way kind of communication where we're informing them about what we're doing and providing results to end users. We had a newspaper article in one of the local newspapers. Consulting is where they're informing us, where the entities shared community-specific factors such as concerns about harmful algal blooms in a lake. Whereas involve is more back and forth feedback, where the stakeholders provided feedback that was reflected in the Q-sort methodology that I'll talk about in a second, also the focus group questions that we asked and the research design, and then we shared how their feedback was considered in our ultimate research design. We also had some partners who collaborated very closely with us, like the South Slough NERR and the Watershed Conservancy, the TWC, and some advisory group members helped with decision making to make sure the process and products served management needs. And ultimately, some of our community partners / research team, the end users who were part of our research team, were empowered to write grants with us, co-author papers, and other end products. Kat mentioned that we did focus groups to answer our 2 research questions. The first, we wanted to know what were the social metrics of estuarine restoration that were most germane to this group. And secondly, how those metrics might differ based on place characteristics. That's why we chose 3 different bays. How they might differ with people's experience working with government agencies that were involved in those restoration projects, and the extent to the educational outreach, as Kat mentioned, whether there was a NERRS versus a university, museum versus an educational outreach specialist. So we collected focus group data to measure the perception of those involved with or potentially affected by restoration in Alsea, Coos, and Yaquina Bays. We wanted to get a mix of audiences, so we recruited end users who are restoration managers or natural resource managers. We also wanted to recruit people who get information from them, as well as landowners and people who live adjacent to these restoration projects. But I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the focus groups because this audience here today might be interested in how that actually worked. So first, this was our advisory group and our end users who collaborated and were empowered in this project to help us recruit and invite participants. We gave presentations at local meetings, and we created this huge contact list of over 230 people based on recommendations from our advisory group and people we know. We try to use a snowball method to recruit from business owners and residents and get a really large, diverse group of people there. However, I do want to say that this was during COVID-19. We luckily were able to do it in person between two COVID-19 surges, but that absolutely influenced who was able to come to the focus groups. However, we feel that we really were able to capture the perceptions from kind of diehard restoration people who are very concerned with marsh restoration. Another thing that we did that I thought was really unique and something that doesn't really happen in my other research projects, which was to have the ecologists in the group and the end users be the facilitators right there in the focus groups. So we did a training and created a script for the focus groups and had the Kat and the other ecologists actually be collecting the social data with us. And then they were able to also have that lens of understanding the social data that was coming in. So it wasn't these two separate ecology over here and social over here, but we were intertwined with collecting the data. We tested 10 social metrics that are common indicators in the marine science, social science literature: the aesthetics, how marsh restoration looks, sense of place, the intrinsic value of nature, human health, social relations, biodiversity, resource, safety, trust, and governance. We, before the focus group started, we gave them a Q-sort, which is a forced ranking exercise of 34 statements where participants had to physically put statements on a board of how much they agreed or disagreed or with the statements or how important they were to them. And this we did before they even started talking to each other to ground them in their values and to get them thinking about certain things that are associated with marsh restoration. Then the groups broke out into 3 smaller groups to have structured conversations in which they did a photo ranking exercise, which you can see in this picture right here. And that was another forced ranking exercise where they visually ranked how places looked based on their restoration level. And then after that, they came back to do a conclusion and final discussion. We used thematic coding to analyze the qualitative data and principal factor analysis to analyze the Q-sort. So overall, 44 participants joined the focus group for an overall response rate of 40%. All lived on the Oregon coast. Most lived in the respective bays. We did capture, like I said, the end users. The direct information receivers are people who get technical reports from those end users, and the indirect information receivers, which are people like the landowners. We also had attendance by people who represented local institutions, state institutions, and federal. With the Q-sort, we were able to identify 6 different personas or 6 perspectives. or you can call them typologies, based on the way respondents constructed estuary restoration narratives to support the goals of conservation, community building, local and global coastal safety, economic prosperity, and supporting communities around the world. Overwhelmingly, the strongest perspective in our group ended up to be what we labeled the total conservationist, or people who were concerned most with their ecological outcomes. We saw this across all bays, across all users, and across all institutional levels. The perspective explained 42% variance and had the highest ranking statements about ecological outcomes such as habitat, water quality, ecological function, and reducing pollution. So of all the 10 social metrics that I mentioned, the category that was most germane to our group across the board were ecological outcomes. However, we were also able to identify these very nuanced perspectives where some people lean towards other social metrics more heavily than others. So as you can see, this is our total conservationist persona or perspective that we identified. And we have a total of 6. This is just one. As you can see, each persona includes quotes that we were able to get from the focus groups, their top values, their less urgent values, messages that might resonate with them, and how they compare to the other groups. So one deliverable, a thing that end users and natural resource managers can actually do with this information is to use these types of strategies. Managers can choose to focus on one of the 6 perspectives that we identified, or they can emphasize cross-cutting characteristics, such as the importance of ecological outcomes, because that's what came up most in our group. Our participants wanted to be ensured that estuarine restoration projects were advancing adaptation, addressing conflict through community balance, and were avoiding mistakes. Focusing on these values may help natural resource managers reach their target audiences. Given these findings, we recommend that managers situate outreach and communication in widely shared values before addressing beliefs or attitudes. So we were really interested in grounding in values which were very cross-cutting and allowed people to see where they agreed first before they disagreed. For example, beginning with water quality and wildlife habitat in this particular community promoted open-mindedness before addressing more controversial topics like dredging that came up. Because our sample trended toward one main perspective, which might not always be the case, but because it did in ours, messages might not have to be that different for early adopters to be effective. If we are able to get the NERRS collaborative, we are going to take this across the Pacific coast to different NERRS sites to test these messages to see if they resonate at a larger scale. And now I will hand it over to Julie, who will talk about the ecological data methods.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Okay, I think this works. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the process for gathering and measuring ecological monitoring data first. First, we compiled early or pre-restoration data from reports under broad metric categories, including vegetation, in which we looked at things like non-native plant species, composition, plant diversity, and dominant salt marsh plant species. Also hydrology, where we assessed channel sinuosity ratios. And we also recorded data on fish and mammal use when they were available, but ended up recording these as presence absence because of inconsistencies in data collection and methodology. We went back and measured the same vegetation transects that were measured before and looked at pre-restoration and present day aerial imagery to assess channel sinuosity. And because we had both pre and post restoration data for vegetation and hydrology, we were able to calculate performance scores using a formula that incorporates both the 2021 values and the amount of change or the lift of the restoration. We then normalized those data and put them on a 1 to 10 scale for later comparison with the social data. We averaged the project scores to produce an estuary-wide score for all 3 bays. And finally, we assessed the number of mentions of each metric in project reports to understand the priorities of restoration managers and what they perceive as important, and also what they think they're able to achieve given funding and other constraints. Just to give you an idea of the types of data that we collected, this plot shows percent cover of non-native plant species at all of the projects shown on the x-axis, and the yellow bar shows pre-restoration or just post-restoration data, and the blue bars show present-day data. So you can see there was a decrease in non-native plant species cover in Coons, Marsh, Frederickson, Pool Slough, Y3, and Lint Slough. And we found that 7 out of 9 projects resulted in either fewer non-native plant species and or percent cover. We also looked at channel sinuosity. So just to orient you, the projects are now on the y-axis and the channel sinuosity ratio values are on the x-axis. And each of these points is a marsh channel. The green points are the starting values in that marsh channel, and the blue points are the ending values in the marsh channel. And the left side of this bar shows the average of the green points, and the right side shows the average of the blue points. So this is basically just showing channel sinuosity change over time. And the numbers below them show percent change. So we found overall that 8 out of 9 projects resulted in more sinuous channels on average, and the only one that decreased actually had a pretty high sinuosity average value to begin with, and didn't really decrease that much. So there wasn't much of a decrease there. So we ran into a couple of challenges when trying to compare these two data types. The first being that usually social data is gathered on a much larger scale than ecological monitoring data, which is generally on the site scale. So to address this, we chose to scale up the monitoring data to the estuary scale, because during focus groups, we realized that's how most people were talking about estuaries, at this much larger scale. Next, we combined data into broad metric categories, and we picked these first 4 metric categories: vegetation, hydrology, fish use, and mammal use, because that's what was available in the monitoring data. And then we added in bird use and human factors to encompass some of the social data that didn't fall into those first 4 categories. Also, we know ecological data is quantitative, but social data from focus groups is qualitative. So we gathered some quantitative social data from the focus groups in addition to that nuanced, more qualitative data for comparison to the quantitative monitoring data. And we did this in 2 ways: the Q-sort activity, which Melissa described before, and also a photo ranking activity, where during breakout groups they were forced to rank a series of 10 photos, 2 for each of these first 5 metric categories, where 1 photo was meant to be a high ecological function representation of that metric, and 1 photo was meant to be a low ecological function representation. And you'll see what I'm talking about when I go through the results. But first, I want to talk about the Q-sort results and the top 5 value statements that we got from the Q-sorts. So people valued salt marsh restoration for increasing habitat for fish and wildlife, increasing ecological function in general, enhancing water quality, reducing the amount of pollution in water bodies, and minimizing the impacts of sea level rise. Here are the results from the photo ranking exercise, and on the y-axis here you can see the group ranking, where 1 is the best and 10 is the worst. And here are the photographs we used on the bottom. I know these are kind of small, but just to give an example, the hydrology photographs show a very sinuous channel and lots of vegetative habitat. And this low ecological function version on the right shows a more manipulated system with a straightened channel. And And really overall, folks tended to value the higher ecological function photographs on the left of each set. And this also gave us a sense for how they view the individual metric categories also. So visually, they seem to value this fish photograph and the hydrology photograph, followed by vegetation, wildlife, and bird use. So we took those two quantitative social values and averaged them, and also put them on a 1 to 10 scale for comparison. And we combined all of those data into this linking matrix that you can see on the right here. Just to orient you to the columns, we have each of the 3 bays. And then within each bay, we show the number of report mentions from project reports, the social score, and the ecological performance score. And really the key takeaway from this is that there are some mismatches between social and management perspectives and the monitoring data. One clear discrepancy is a high social ranking for bird and mammal use, along with limited mention in project reports and no monitoring of bird use of habitat. So managers might consider taking advantage of prior collected bird data or citizen science data like local breeding bird counts or Christmas bird counts, or eBird lists to address this public value. One project in particular found a creative way to assess mammal use by looking at aerial imagery of beaver dams and counting the number of dams at the site. And this is a pretty simple method if that imagery is available and if beaver species are of interest. Managers might also consider community outreach that focuses on how other commonly measured metrics like vegetation are linked to resources for birds and mammals like habitat and food. Fish use of habitat was ranked moderately to highly by public end users and mentioned more often by managers in project reports than birds and mammals. However, fish data were not measured that often, and even when they were, collection methods weren't standardized. And there's a reason for this. There's clearly a variety of methods used to assess fish presence dependent on the species of interest, the habitat, et cetera, but that results in these data not being usable or comparable. So for our purposes, we assess presence absence, but it might be interesting in the future to develop an index to put these disparate fish data together and then use these more specific data in outreach efforts. For projects where gathering data on fish abundance and presence is just not feasible financially or for whatever reason, we suggest using or trying to use fish data from online repository like CDFW's online fish data repository. And we're working on compiling a list of these repositories for distribution to our end users. Vegetation and hydrology are both important proxies for other marsh functions and was mentioned frequently as a goal in project reports. Vegetation was ranked slightly more favorably by community members than hydrology. So we suggest focusing outreach materials on how vegetation and hydrology affect other categories, as I mentioned, to communicate the importance of these metrics and why scientists measure them. Last but definitely not least, we also assess projects in terms of human factors, which incorporates such social values that Melissa described before, such as mode of communication, sentiment, sense of place, economic values, physical health and well-being, among others. And these metrics are not currently assessed in salt marsh restoration projects, but it might be useful to understand how they change after restoration to really communicate the importance of restoration to the general public. Previous studies in forestry management have used surveys to gather data on these values relative to biological monitoring metrics. So surveys may be one mechanism. So surveying community members pre and post restoration may be a mechanism to track these metrics. The next iteration of our project will work to incorporate these social values into restoration assessments at a broader scale, as Melissa mentioned, and Sabra will talk a little bit about that later on. In terms of dissemination and our outputs, I showed you our linking matrix, which is one of the main ones. We also have a summary of personas that Melissa developed, and we are creating this brochure for our local project partners that really brings all this information together into a digestible format, and that's where these images are from. So we are including this summary of perceptions shown here on the bottom left, and also the top values from the Q sort shown on the bottom right here. And we use a diagram to both link the commonly monitored metrics to some of those values. So for example, we talk about the importance of sinuous channels for fish and other wildlife and vegetation. We're also using it to describe how local restoration projects in Oregon are addressing those values. So for example, 8 out of 9 Oregon restoration projects show increased channel sinuosity. And all of these projects will be available on our project website within the next month or two. We're kind of finalizing things, but there's a QR code at the end of this presentation that brings you straight to the website. And with that, I'll hand it over to Sabra to talk a little bit about how these outputs will be used.
Thanks, Julie. Well, obviously I'm not Sabra, but Sabra was unable to join us today, but was kind enough to provide a little recording for us of just an overview. So I will go ahead and cue that video up now.
Greetings, everyone. Sorry I can't be there in person. As mentioned earlier, I'm Sabra Comet, the Coastal Training Program Coordinator, and I'll be talking about the products and benefits of the project from the NERRS perspective. So first off, especially during the focus group session of the project, this allowed us to break out of the usual audiences that we engage with at the reserve or with the reserve, especially those that have an inherent distrust of government. The partners had a different image than that usually projected by the reserve, so allowing us to talk to stakeholders in a different way, and helping to hear from them how they see marsh restoration in a way that the reserve wouldn't necessarily be able to. It was also very beneficial to utilize other networks, such as those of Paul Engelmeyer of the Wildlife Conservancy that has worked in the Oregon coast, especially the Central Coast, for many decades. The project itself, as well as the products, are extremely cross-sectoral, something that the NERRS, especially the CTP sector, is looking to utilize. The blend of social sciences as well as biological sciences is something that we are still figuring out, but this was a great example of how to do so. And additionally, the products are anticipated to serve the needs of many sectors and be able to be very reusable. Additionally, as a new CTP, it was very valuable to see the metrics that were at first measured using very different disciplines evolve into a seamless blended product that, again, could be used very cross-sectorally. So I'll go ahead and dive into the products themselves and kind of how we structured them. So when we were talking about the different products that we could create out of this project, I suggested we look at it in kind of a Russian nesting doll, to where the broadest audience and the product that went along with that included the broader wording. And then as we got to more specific audiences, more specific users, those were the ones that would have more technical language and be more specific. So when we're looking at the brochure, as you can see from the inverted pyramid over here, we're thinking of it as being used in talking to the broadest audiences. Therefore, we tried to avoid as much jargon, tried to make it more public friendly, and also anticipating that this brochure is easily handed out at outreach events. It can be used at the front desk of visitor center and can be an easy handoff, introducing the concepts easily and with a glance. The personas is anticipated to be of particular interest to management, reserve management. These are anticipated to help break down messaging that can be used both at the legislative level but also at the individual stakeholder level. But again, avoiding some of the jargon, but assuming that this is used for a slightly more specific audience but can still be used by sector coordinators and etc. The matrix, being significantly more complex to utilize, is anticipated to have a more specific audience and therefore is going to require more instruction to use, but is still going to be useful for education, research, management, as well as CTP. And hopefully several 1 to 3 peer-reviewed journal articles are going to be probably of interest to the narrowest audience, but also have the most detail, the most field-specific jargon, and have the most pointed messaging. So when we're trying to think of how to structure the many different audiences, the many different uses we're hoping that this project could inform, this is how we tried to organize it. And I think we were rather successful. And last, I'm going to talk very briefly about a follow-up project that is in review. It's pending, but we have put together the proposal for a follow-up project that would expand the methodology and ideas to other West Coast NERRS sites, mostly in California. The methodology would be used and approved upon. I would also be testing how well this can be scaled up. The products would then be tailored to the uses needed, but still trying to use that tiered approach, and also testing whether this could be replicable, which hopefully it will be, and then potentially be used in other regions. And a key goal of this project will be testing the messages of the personas generated in this project and tying it to the socio-demographics data that we can call up. Again, all this is pending should we be funded. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it back over to the team.
All right, thanks, Nick. So just acknowledgements really quickly. Thanks to you all for coming, and for Nick and the group there for hosting the presentation and making it all work. And also lots of thanks to our advisory group and Oregon's Mid-Coast Watershed Council technical team, who we met with lots and gave us feedback throughout, and to our 44 focus group participants. See several of our project partners, but we had others at South Slough Wetlands Conservancy and UC Davis as well. And Vanessa's here able to answer questions with us, which we'll take in a second. And of course, funding was from the NERRS Science Collaborative. And our last slide is just taking questions. And there's the project website too, or the QR code for it. And so, Nick, how do we handle questions here?
A bit clunkily, if I'm being honest. That's not a word, but it gets the point across. So what we'll do is just type your questions into the chat as they occur to you. And we'll verbalize them to the speakers, but don't be shy. I didn't see a whole lot coming in during the actual presentation, but it looks like we have at least one coming in already. All right. So based on your experience with this project, do you have any general advice for other researchers looking to integrate biological and social science data to study their environmental issues? And I know we had talked about putting those in the place where you can all see them. So I'm going to just copy that over to our little Q&A document here. Looks like Megan beat me to it, or Jane, one of them did. Megan and Jane are here too, and they're helping us field questions.
Melissa, do you want to take that first?
Sure. I think what was just so unique about this project that made everything really come together was the willingness of Kat and Julie and Vanessa and Sabra. We really had ecologists and end users being a part of the social science data collection, and their willingness to learn a technique in a completely different field, something that they weren't trained in, but that they were willing to jump in and try it out. And I think we all really learned a lot from that experience and got a lot out of it.
Thanks. And building on that, one thing to mention is that NOAA holds a facilitation seminar, and Sabra set that up so that we could all take that before running the focus groups, and that was really helpful to get us up to speed to do that, and for all our other facilitation work. I felt like it was very from an ecologist standpoint, that it was really worthwhile hearing from the different people who attended the focus groups. And whether you hold focus groups or just reach out more to community members, it was definitely a powerful experience, especially to get them there together, because they started listening to each other. And that's something that we're hoping to do next, is to train anyone interested in the West Coast NERRS that we're working with, and ideally after that, all NERRS, of how to start bringing people together for consensus building, pretty much to root everything in values, so that one of the things we found was how common values were among everyone who attended. And we had this one situation, for example, in a focus group where we were doing the photo rankings, and this person who has dairy cattle or dairy cows, he has been very vocal in the community and ranked the picture with dairy cows in a sort of flooded banks of a channel as the worst possible picture. And everyone else in the focus, not everyone else, but several other people in the focus group who are diehard ecologists were saying things like, "What, you think that?" And it was this great moment where they realized that they really agreed, and then they came together very easily after that. So, so the conversations were powerful for me, at least as an ecologist, to hear what people felt about restoration, and then also bringing different community members together, I think is very worthwhile, so they can hear from each other and realize that they agree. Hopefully that will lead more support for South Slough NERRS projects as well. Julie, want to add anything on either from the focus groups or the ecological perspective?
Yeah, I'll just echo kind of what Kat and Melissa said. Really having all of the researchers fully involved, not just, we weren't just involved in the social science side. Melissa was very involved in our processes too. And we were just saying the other day, coming up with those quantitative social metrics using the Q-sort and the photo ranking were so key. And Melissa really brought that to the table, and that was the linking piece. So it's just really useful to have everybody involved, not just not just to consult with, but having them involved in the design also.
And from the linking matrix, we really learned that, one, how much people, or from the social part, we learned how much people value the different marsh aspects of the salt marsh ecosystem, but also we found that we take some of those metrics well, or maybe a little too well even, and we don't uniformly collect the fish data in a way that is easy to link to the projects, but people really care about fish here in Pacific Northwest. That's not surprising. And just there's a message, I think, for everybody that we can do better on collecting metrics and designing restoration projects in the first place with people and people's use in mind. I remember the first restoration projects I ever saw were in areas that were gated off and people couldn't access at all, and they weren't clearly increasing ecosystem function uniformly. And so maybe it was good in a couple of those cases that people didn't see them as we were early in restoration. But I think that involving community members in the planning in discussions ahead of time of why it's worthwhile, and the benefits in the end of this restoration has helped you, and ideally benefits including people on the land, would really make restoration more powerful.
All right, we got lots of questions coming in here, so we'll see if we can fly through them. Just a quick note, which I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but if you don't see your question answered in session, we'll try to pass them along to the presenters to answer and include in the summary document. But Good to see all these awesome questions coming in. So we'll see how many we can get through in the next few minutes. We have a good question here that I think it's a good question, but I might be biased and I'll be the first to admit that. It's a little bit about science communication. So how did you determine what terms are jargon for the different product levels?
We asked people in our families, we asked each other, and our team includes end users who have very different perspectives, and we brought them some of the products, eventually all of them, to different watershed councils, and across those we helped identify jargon. I also teach science communication, and have started listening to it. We do an exercise where someone will give a talk and we'll just hold up a red card whenever someone uses something that we think is jargon. It's great for identifying jargon.
That sounds fun. Julie, Melissa, anything to add?
I was just going to mention the value of having the advisory group to go over some of our materials, to flag what is jargon for them. And Kat and Julia flag my jargon, that is jargon for social science. And I flagged Kat the other day, she said HABs, and I was like, what is that? So I think we also do it internally with each other. That's helpful.
Yeah, nothing to add. Great responses.
Okay, next question then. What challenges did you encounter when talking to partners/respondents? How did you handle differing opinions between community members and ecologists?
We were mostly in listen mode when we were talking with community members. So, and I don't know that many different opinions came up. Sometimes they did, but our goal there really was to listen to what they had to say. And there were times in the focus groups where people were disagreeing. We had to, I remember in one, Sabra was just like, stop. And she brought people back to, we're listening to each other and having a civil conversation. And that was a couple of other responses to this.
I'm just unmuting myself really quick to just put in my 2 cents. When I was reaching out to advisory group folks, one of the things that we addressed in that ladder of involvement is that there are certain places on that ladder where you can articulate how much a comment or input, critiques, or suggestions will be included. And we did try and set an expectation of listening, but we did not always set the expectation that no matter what someone's comment was, that it would be implemented. So having clear communication and boundaries with the people who are giving us comments, I think was really helpful in setting our expectations. And that was definitely pointed out to me by Melissa, who introduced the whole eco set of researchers to that way of incorporating comments.
Thank you. If nobody else has any other notes, I'll move on to the next one so we can keep flying through as many as we can. Next question, great work. So comment for you first and foremost, and echoed heartily. The persona results are really interesting. Were any of the personas not supportive of restoration or don't value salt marshes? If not, do you think those personas exist and just weren't captured?
I'll take that one. I'm sorry, can you put the question? Oh, there it is. Okay. So as far as the personas, the participants who came to the focus groups very much wanted us to know that they supported marsh restoration in theory, in broad brush statements, but they differed on how that should be implemented and to what level stakeholders should be involved in that. So the folks who did come did say that they all supported marsh restoration in general. That absolutely, our sample is biased. Oh, and I also wanted to say in the focus groups too, there were a lot of people, a lot of quotes that I noticed that kind of brought up opposing viewpoints through talking through other people. Like, I don't think this, but my neighbor says that they don't like marsh restoration for that. So in our particular group, we didn't have somebody say, I don't value marsh restoration. And it is biased because of where we are in Oregon, who was able to physically come to a in-person focus group during COVID-19. We did have pretty strict measures. Everyone had to wear a mask and get their temperature taken and things like that. And we had people not come because of that. So whether or not that's associated with marsh restoration perceptions, but there was some filtering out of certain people because of the design of the focus group. And if we get the NERRS collaborative, the whole point of the collaborative would to get a bigger sample size across the entire coast. And so we could use what we learned from the focus group to test that very thing of if there are perspectives that are along the whole Pacific coast that we weren't able to capture in these very specific focus groups.
Any final quick thoughts there from Kat or Julie or Vanessa, if you want to pop back on?
What Melissa said.
What Melissa said. All right. Well, we are out of time, so I will have to leave it there for today. Just a reminder, you can submit questions into the session and they'll be saved in session, or you can enter them into the exit survey that will pop up as soon as you leave the session. So thank you all for joining us today. Big thank you to our presenters for putting all their hard work into these presentations and making sure that everything comes across nicely and easy to understand. Next webinar will be on June 29th. Should be seeing announcements for that soon. So you can always go to the website to see to sign up for webinar announcements as well. And with that, everybody have a great day.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.